Hi, I'm Justin Moorman.
And I'm Katie Thornton, and this is the Re-Education of Schools podcast,
where we have open, honest conversations about how to better understand social emotional learning, trauma-informed care, the whys behind student behavior, and how to help kids navigate it all as they go through school and life.
Welcome back. Episode 13, Beautiful Liar, Misconceptions of Trauma-Informed Care, which there are plenty, right? So we're going to be talking a little bit today about some of that, what they are, right? Why are they?
Hey everybody, let's keep the conversation going.
Like and
all
subscribe
the things.
below. And
I guess I don't have to preview it. You're going to listen to it, and you'll find out in a minute. Anyway,
I'm pumped about this episode.
Yeah,
I'm excited because
Why is that though?
Because I feel like a lot of the judgment that comes with this work is all misconceptions, and I just would like to debunk some of that now. Like,
sure,
let's just talk about it because I feel like the people just don't really know, and so then they, we'll talk about that. But yeah, I just think I'm excited because if we're going to move this work forward, we have to clear up the misconceptions.
Yeah. No, I think, clarity, right? Everybody has to be thinking and talking about the same things. Yeah. Well, a good place for us to start is actually talking about what trauma-informed care is. Hopefully there's like a whole process. You guys have probably been able to figure it out by now that we go through where there's certain questions, we prepare, whatever, the whole thing. You got to carry this one. I wrote almost nothing for this one. Okay. I just assumed you were going to be able to carry it.
You know me well enough. You assumed correctly. Here we go. All right, trauma.
Real quick, I guess. I don't know. Yeah,
trauma-informed care seeks to realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand paths for recovery.
Yeah.
So think about trauma-informed care there's of education, but trauma-informed care really could look at hospital settings, right? I think we'll explore some of those things broadly as we move through with this podcast. But trauma-informed care, it can be focused on a lot of different aspects. So you're thinking about trauma, how we're going to recover from it, recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in patients, families, and staff, or you can think about students in that way. Integrate knowledge about trauma into policies. This is the huge part. This is the shift that needs to happen. So there's a continuum that you can go through, like trauma aware, trauma sensitive, right? To be really trauma informed, to be a trauma informed school, you actually have to have policy, practices, and systems in place that reflects the core beliefs of trauma informed care.
I think that's the hard part. Not that we're going to necessarily be able to delve into that today, but I think that's one of the really
maybe
hard
a
parts.
Future episode.
Yeah. It's one thing to be trauma, whatever the other labels
sensitive
are.
Or aware.
Sure. Yeah. But if we're going to actually be doing stuff, it comes down to policy and like systematic things that are put in place. Yeah.
So putting those practices in place and actively avoiding re-traumatization. So think about some of the things that we do to kids that are what we know about historical trauma, about adverse childhood experiences, about activated stress response systems, and sometimes how we respond to kids reactivates trauma. So I have found that whatever your thing is, right? I find that sometimes I'll hear a tone that somebody talks to in a certain way, and then I feel like, why am I feeling this way right now? It makes me uncomfortable when people talk to kids that way. Yeah. But, it's historically, right, what you've been through and all that kind of thing. So anyway, that's kind of like the snapshot of what trauma-informed care is and how it's broader than education, but we're talking about it in an educational setting, which will go back to policy, procedures, and those kind of things.
Yeah. All right, so some of the misconceptions, some of the things that I kind of thought of, I almost would like to address them one at a time, but I think we can go through them and then we can go back and address our lists, I guess. But I think one of the misconceptions is that this means that anything goes, right? Kids can do whatever they want because you can't trigger somebody, right? You gotta walk on eggshells. You can't do you can't do anything. You gotta just let whatever happens has to happen. Anything goes, right? That there is no discipline. I think that's a big one, that you're supposed to just follow kids around, right? Let them do whatever they want, that the kids who are fine actually don't matter that much and get hurt by this approach.
That's a good one.
And that this is super political driven.
Yeah, I also would add that people say, well, I've had things happen to me, I'm fine. And I survived the education system. Why do we need to change anything? Kids are doing this on purpose.
Sure.
This is probably another one, and that adults are a complete pushover. To add that to the list.
Yeah. I think those are good ones. Okay, well, which one do you want to... I
I
don't know that we need to debunk them. I guess that's not really what we're doing. But I think those are misconceptions. I guess maybe we have to kind of debunk them some. So what can we do to help curve some of these misconceptions? I think we have to address some of these, right?
Yeah. I would say it goes back to education, right? We have to provide professional development about the science. This is all, so trauma-informed care is not like a philosophy or like, it is in a sense, but it's, there's science behind this. There's research that says this is why this is happening, and these are the things that feed into this. This is how the brain works. This is how adversity, we know for sure the body and experiences are connected. This is not someone's theory. These are things that have been scientifically proven.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably the first part, is getting the education in people's hands. So I think a lot of it is you don't know better, so you don't do better, and you don't understand it. So I think professional development is a huge part of how we can curb some of this misconception. I think allowing time and space, I think we have really noticed that it's okay to let people talk about it. So I think because we avoid talking about this or avoid talking about behavior that we just handle and it's done and it's gone, we're not allowing the conversation to happen or people to really feel how they're going to feel about it. When you shut that down, then that doesn't help any misconceptions either.
Yeah.
So really allowing some conversation. So tell me why you think that. Let's talk through that. What I hear you saying is, and here's another lens I'm gonna look through it, and here's how I can support or coach you through that part. So allowing the conversations. I just said, again, allow space for really honest feedback and conversations, because if people feel like they need to be on, that's when I think we feed into a lot of misconceptions, because we don't allow people to really have some honest feedback. And then I think keep on circling back with people. Circle back to the research, to the conversations, to the practices, and why those things are important, and keep it at the forefront. I think we have found that we've shifted a lot of mindsets just from allowing some of those things to happen.
Yeah. And it didn't have to be like all at once, right? Like I think in the changes that we've seen in people who may not even recognize that they've shifted that much, which I think is actually pretty cool, that there's been shifts that people probably don't even realize have happened in them. But that doesn't happen if you're like, do this now or else. You know, that happens through conversation and understanding, relationship, right? It's all those things that you were kind of talking about. You have to be able to have a lot of willingness to offer a lot of grace to people because people are going to have everybody. Like we have bad days where we aren't going to have a great response, and we're going to do something that wasn't best practice, or it wasn't the most trauma-informed thing to do, or whatever it might be. I mean, we're all humans. We're going to screw up sometimes, and being able to let people know that that's okay, and that it's okay to lean on each other, and that it's okay to be honest when we're like, I disagree, with the approach that we're getting ready to take here on something. But then don't take that as like a personal affront to you. If you're the person making that decision and trying to follow a certain, trauma kind of informed approach to things, don't take that as like a real personal attack, but instead, hear that, accept it. And then when you're in a good spot to be able to respond, again, don't hear argue, don't hear go tell them they're wrong. Like when you're in a good spot to respond though, and go have a conversation, be like, hey, so here, I want you to just know what I was thinking and why I was doing what I was doing and what I was hoping to get out of that because of the decision I made. People want to know those things. And I think sometimes we're so quick to avoid conflict or what we perceive is going to be conflict, that we really avoid having really important conversations. But that's where we grow. We grow through tough conversations. We grow through discomfort. Nobody's growing and getting a lot better when life is real easy and there are no needs and you don't have to grow at all and whatever. You don't improve in those times. So be willing to have those conversations. I think it's always one of my biggest things. Is that.
Yeah. Right? And I think one of the misconceptions, this is maybe one that we talked through on the list, is that we filmed an episode about the consequences and discipline and those kind of things, but there 100% needs to be rules. There needs to be boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not the Wild West, right? Yeah. That would be crazy. But the shift is we're teaching kids. So if we keep doing two kids, then they're coming back and doing the same thing. Like at some point you got to stop doing the same thing and expecting different results. Our job is to teach kids. It's our approach. Yeah. It's what is our plan? If this happens again, let's talk through that with them. I think we need to talk through like how we're going to restore kids back into our community, how we're going to repair relationships, how we're going to teach them how to manage and handle conflicts. A lot of this is teaching kids how to, because the old policy says we're doing stuff to kids and we keep on doing it continuously and disproportionately.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of the shift that we're making, and it's important to have consequences and rules. They're just natural consequences.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense for a kid to be tardy 8 times and you're going to suspend them for 2 days.
Sure.
At like a
Sure.
secondary level, right? They wanted to be out of school. That's not a natural consequence, right? So how can we do that?
Yeah, and I think, again, and we've said this before, but I think it always bears repeating, because this is really one of the biggest things that we hear is that, just anything goes, there's no more discipline, yada, however you want to phrase it. We hear it phrased a bunch of different ways. I think that and we're quick to say, like, if a kid didn't know how to multiply, we wouldn't tell them, like, well, now you're in trouble, right? It's a similar idea. I think what's hard is that with discipline, like, it's super uncomfortable for us. We kind of expect as educators to have to go back and reteach and take a lot of time to teach academics. And we aren't necessarily always as mentally or emotionally prepared to have to do the same thing with like social emotional learning kind of stuff, or behavior, I guess, if that's how you want to frame it. And so we know that it's going to take a long time to teach multiplication for the kid that doesn't know it when he should know it already. We also should expect that it's going to take time. And I think that's maybe the response that's potentially helpful to teachers when they have a hard time with this idea. Why aren't you just suspending them? Well, the kid would also not learn math if he was like, well, you failed this math test. Now you actually have to be kicked out of math for 2 days. Mm-hmm. Right? So, and then come back and hopefully you've learned math by then, because we're going to test you again. Well, no, instead we do things that are helpful and we teach them skills and we work with them. That's the same thing we're doing with this approach, this trauma-informed care kind of approach. We're doing that same thing. It's a little bit less comfortable until you realize what's happening and kind of see the results. But it's hard to see results because we're so quick to give up. A lot of us are quick to give up on it because we're not seeing the results quick, and it's uncomfortable. It's just hard. It's a hard thing. And I think that's where a lot of grace and understanding has to come into play for
Allow
people.
the conversations, right, to happen, that we're kind of looking at intervention and our experiences for kids to help teach them how to do these things, because what we know about adversity and historical trauma and those kind of things, kids' family structures have changed. We talked about this on another episode as well, but like those things have all changed. So kids aren't coming in with the skill set, and we're in really inclusive school environments that we really have to come back and just teach kids some of those things that maybe instead of expecting them to know them.
What do you think about the idea of it being really political?
Oh,
we've heard that.
Yeah, that
more than once.
Yeah, that we should. I think it goes back to like miseducation, right? For people, unfortunately, we're in a system of a lot of people making decisions for education that are not educated about education.
Sure.
It's like a theory of what they think should be happening in schools, but they're not living any of the reality. So I think, unfortunately, education in general is just political, except it doesn't get the funding or the resources that it needs. We just make decisions and policies and wish for the best for everybody, and hence why our teaching field has been pretty much, we're down to a huge teacher shortage, and people just don't want to go into it because of all that stuff. It's unfortunate. This is the state we're in, though.
Yeah. I think that one of the things we can do to help kind of curve some of these misconceptions too is that we can, because we say, relationships are what heal the brain, right? What heal trauma. And so I think, having those loving relationships, but doing it, again, the right way. We've talked about this before, but what that looks like correctly, and correct, real care. If you feel uncomfortable with the word love, talk to your therapist about why you feel uncomfortable with the word love if you choose to. But loving kids the right way doesn't, that correct love, right? Like actual love, like you're not going to just say anything goes. There are no consequences for your actions, because ultimately, like when you look long term, that's not a very loving approach, especially with kids, right? Because then the kids don't actually have the chance to improve and get better. that's where it gets weird and dicey, and then people could potentially say, right, well, that's what we're saying. Like, so there needs to be discipline. And I guess maybe what do you say to that before I say anything else? Like, so then they're like, well, there needs to be, because we are saying there needs to be discipline.
Yeah.
And then they're saying, yes, we agree there needs to be discipline. But where's
the shift is,
how do you common ground that?
Yeah, 100% there needs to be discipline, there needs to be consequences, right? We have to teach kids. The difference is what we're doing with kids. We were doing stuff to kids and then isolating, embarrassing, shaming them, taking them out of the school community and culture. I think the shift is we're embracing kids, we're loving kids, we're setting up boundaries with them, we're teaching them, we're progress monitoring their outcomes, we're using data, we're connecting with them. So we're being very intentional about a lot of proactive stuff instead of being reactive. So that's really the shift that is happening right now that needs to happen. And you're right, loving, healthy relationships, we've talked about this before, that those things all have boundaries. Yeah. So you would not be in a relationship with somebody if there wasn't boundaries. Teaching's no different than parenting, right? So if you just let your kids do whatever you want, you're not a great, right? That's not good. You look at somebody like, they're a horrible parent, right? Sure. Your kids need to know how to act at a restaurant. Your kids need to know how to, right? There has to be some rules in your house, some structure, some routines. Doesn't mean you don't love your kids and that they're not going to grow up to be great people, but the boundaries need to be in place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is one of the, increasingly for me, one of like kind of the, I don't want to say hot button, but one of the things that I'm becoming more and more aware of is that if we, there are a lot of people that are bought into this work.
Yep.
That want to do well, want to help kids that have experienced trauma, want to have the right approaches to all of this. And they're quick to hear the regulate, love, let me, and it almost comes out as, let me make you happy.
Yeah.
I want to make you happy.
Or can I reward you?
Yes. How can I just make this end, whatever uncomfortable situation a student might be in, how can I make that end by making them happy again? And so then what happens is we get a bunch of maybe non-examples of what trauma-informed care really should look like. And I think that maybe does more harm than anything to people that are not yet bought in, because they see this stuff happening and then they're like, that's insanity. Like they're just like, there aren't the expectations. There aren't the boundaries. And that's why I more and more, I think like one of the most important things to get out there is if you're bought in, if you're listening, and if you think this is like, yeah, this is the right approach, be very mindful of kind of having both sides of what trauma-informed care is. Yes, there's regulation. Yes, there's like relationship building. Yes, there's all of that. There is also the side that has boundaries, that has expectations, and that side is less glamorous, right? Mm-hmm. It leads potentially to negative reactions from students and things like that, and then you have to also still be dealing with the negative reaction, negative emotion, pushback, whatever it might be from the student, and still create the relationship and be there and care and all those things. It's hard. Like, it's not just like this super easy. It's hard.
Yeah, just to even go into without details, right? But we have a child right now that's really going through a super traumatic experience. And so some of the reaction might have been like, we should order special lunch or go do stuff, right? And I think you were really quick to be like, no, regular school today. Like, we need predictable, consistent routines. Yeah, sure. Doesn't mean you're not patient. Yeah. And that we don't sit and like co-regulate a little bit more. Yeah. But to think like, well, you can just do whatever, you're having a hard, going through this horrible thing right now. Just go do whatever you want. That would be actually not healthy, loving, or supportive, because we know boundaries, the predictable routines of those things, and doing regular school was the thing that child needed more than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. It's hard though. I mean, it's hard to do that. But if you're out there and you're bought into this work, hear that over and over again, that really be mindful of doing both sides. And if you're out there and you're maybe not bought in, you're like, I want to see what these people are saying are misconceptions so that I can yell at them later. I don't know what your motivation would be, but if you are, just understand, like, hey, everybody's working to improve and to do this right. And some people probably are further along or are getting it quicker, and also be patient with people that are maybe not quite hitting both sides of that coin super well.
Yeah.
All right. So how can we? Do you have any more to add on the misconceptions? I'm sure
I
we could
think
talk
we
forever.
could talk forever and maybe with other people too.
Yeah.
About this. Yeah.
Okay. Well, how can we help support others with their understanding in this work then?
I think we have to be patient. That's hard for me because I'm like, let's go, right?
Right now, let's all just have it perfect right this second.
Yeah, this isn't a quick turnaround, right? Be patient and understanding. Allow people to have open dialogue. I appreciate that people will come talk to me about their misconceptions or disagreeing with me, or I think the conversations are good. It's good for me. It's good. I've learned and grown from a lot of those conversations and found some more balance because I think we've talked about this. I go super into sympathetic, that I just want to do.
Yes.
And you're really good about pulling me back into like, no boundary, right? So I think it's good to have those conversations for people even on the other end that say more punitive, right? But somewhere we got to find that balance because we still have to run a school, right?
Yeah, sure.
So be supportive. It's not that what you're doing, it's not that I'm not going to provide consequences or boundaries. It's just that I hear what you're saying is you need support. Here's how I can provide it for you. Here's a system we can put in place. And usually it's like, oh, I didn't think about that. I've never had anybody say, thank you for supporting me. So I think when we say shut it down and say, no, that's not what's going to happen. It's like what I hear you saying is you need help and support right now. Here's how I can help and provide that.
Yeah.
So do that. Provide the research and education. Keep on going back and going back. This is all research-based work. We're not making it up, right? This is all linked back to how the brain science and relationships and bodies and everything are connected. Be graceful. I have a hard time with that one sometimes, but like being graceful towards others and wherever they're at in that journey. And just know people will toggle both sides of the line. They'll be really on board one day and then hop back over. And then you just have to be graceful to like give them some time and space to like, they'll come back, but you just have to sometimes give some space for that.
Yeah.
And build confidence. I think people feel like they're not doing it right.
Yeah.
Because there's not a place.
Yeah, we hear that all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Build confidence. Compliment people. Hey, thank you so much for the time that you took to restore that conversation, to co-regulate with that kid, the way you approach this. Thank you for asking for help when you did. Like, I think just give each other that continuous feedback loop, I think builds confidence. And then people realize, oh, I am doing the work. So I think people think they're not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or that it just, like that if they were doing the work, it would look completely different than what they've ever done before. And there's so much common ground really in what's already happening. I think that's one of the things I had put down, like highlight what people are already doing right and encourage them in that. Like help them realize you are doing some of these things already. It might not look exactly the way that Katie does it, but that's okay because you and Katie are different people, but you're still doing and accomplishing the same things and having the same types of approaches. I think when people hear that and understand that, they're much more willing all of a sudden to hear other aspects of, kind of trauma-informed care and how that can look, and that it may not have to look the exact way it's read about in one book and one author happens to explain it. I think that's hard for people.
Yeah, I would say you see a lot of, just an example, like I've been through some really great trauma training where maybe someone's more yoga or meditation based and they could lead that.
Yeah.
I think we would laugh hysterically through the whole thing, right? Like
Yeah.
we're not going to start a class with.
Yeah, it's not really my thing.
It's not really our how, but it's not that. I think it's awesome.
Yeah,
I
it's
enjoy.
not wrong. Yeah, they're not wrong.
I enjoy going to some of those classes that really do more with mindfulness and those kind of things. I would say that's just not our personality style. Not that either approach is wrong. We'll enter it through more comedy or some humor type based things. All the messaging's the same, but our personality types and how we're approaching kids and those kind of things are just really different. And just being okay that I agree with you that it's going to look different for each person and how they deliver it, but it's not wrong.
Yeah.
It's not wrong. Yeah. If your heart is with doing stuff with kids and teaching them, it's not wrong.
Sure. I said don't get too jargony too. That's how we can kind of help people along. I think early on, there's it's a tough balance to strike, right? Because you want people to understand what we're talking about and what's being talked about. So you have to use some jargon, right? Or some, I don't have another word for it, jargon. But at the same time, if you only land there, people continue out really quick. And people have so much going on, especially during a school year. And they're like, I don't have time to learn all this other stuff. That's why if you can find some of that common ground and talk, maybe this will be offensive to people, but talk like a normal person instead of just living all in science-y jargon world. There's a place for that and there is a time for that. But I think if that's the only place you land, then people get turned off to it or they're like, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have any idea what you're talking about. I mean, I think we've all probably been there. I'm there. I'm there all the time with academics. People will be like, hey, like, da-da-da-da-da, and you might as well be speaking a different language. And I'm like, uh-huh. And they walk out, they're like, what are they talking about? I'm like, oh, I'm not 100% sure. I'll try to figure it out. Like, I don't know what that meant. But I think people can land there. So just watch being too jargony if you're trying to explain and make those connections for people.
Such a good point. I think, we're not going to mislabel or call it something it's not, right?
Sure.
I think we say that even with kids, like call things what they actually are. I think it's okay to give vocabulary. But like the day-to-day, we don't need to edu-speak people out of this to prove that we don't need to come in and talk about like neuroscience in an aspect that is so complex that we're expecting everybody to grasp it. Really, the real shift you'll see is when you start using it as application. Like, here's what this is, but here's how really when we talk about that and use it. And
I found a lot of people do well with that. Like, and if stuff's introduced, right, and more of maybe like a professional development kind of situation, jargon, all the actual vocabulary, and then people are out doing things, and then you go in and you say, hey, like, why don't we try this thing jargon free, like talk about it, whatever, and then afterwards you're like, actually, so this is what we were talking about. You build it like up as opposed to starting like way up high in these themes and then trying to like bring it down to like practical, almost like give them that, walk them through the practical or highlight how they're doing the practical, and then be like, hey, what you actually just did was this. I don't know if you realize that or not. That was a great job. I think that's really helpful to people. I mean, I think being able to explain what to do, but also like why it makes sense. A lot of times, like what our approach is, but why. And again, that maybe sounds counter what I just said, but I think that I try to do a lot of explaining of why. Like, hey, let's try this. This is why I'm saying let's try this, because I think this is what the reaction is we'll get from the kid. And I could be wrong, but I think that's what it's going to be. And I think sometimes if people can see it all the way through and see what the end is, like what the hope is, they're more likely to try. If you're just like, just try this thing, and they're like, why? And you're like, well, because trauma-informed care. Then they're like, well, I'm not bought into that. Like, that sounds crazy. Like, but if you can tell them like what your hope, like the outcome is going to be, I think they're a little bit more willing to try. And then, like you said, patience and grace, right? We talk about that a lot. It's going to be a process.
Yeah. As we're talking through that, I'm thinking more about when you build systems, right?
Yes.
So it's really easy for me to come in as like a building administrator and say, this is what we're going to do. Go. And this is because I said so. This is research. I just said the research said this, so we're trauma informed. If you don't start creating your building systems with input from your staff or your classroom community or with the kids, if we come in and say this is what it is, done, then we will never get buy-in from people, because people will buy in if they're part of building that system, which goes back to PD conversations. We started like a behavior support team type thing at our building to build our tiered behavior system. And I think having people be a part of those conversations and ownership in that, I could have sat down and probably did the whole document and just said, this is what we're doing because I said so.
Sure.
But that's not going to build the system. It's like anything. We take on a new reading curriculum or math curriculum. People don't have voice or buy-in for systems. They'll just be constant misconceptions because they felt like things are being done to them. Yes. So how can you do stuff with people to get them to walk alongside you?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's the same idea that I think we've talked about before, but like a lot of times, especially from a higher level, we can be like, hey, we want to implement trauma-informed care. We want to approach things in that way. Here's what you should be doing with kids, right? Even if it's all the right things, good info. But then we don't do those same things with the adults.
Yeah.
It's crazy to me. And I've watched it at different places. But it's crazy to me because I'm like, yeah, but what you're saying is you should build relationships with kids. That's only like they're gonna be way more likely to like buy in and feel a part and understand and be regulated if you have a relationship with them. You're telling people all these things, but you're not going and building a relationship with the adults. You have to go build a relationship with the adults. And they're like, well, they should just know.
Yeah.
Like, well, that's crazy. Like, that's not.
Yeah.
You have to put the same practices in place with the adults you're working with as you would with the kids in your room. And that actually takes a lot of time. And it means, right, when an adult does something or spouts off or has the reaction you don't want them to have, you can't just be like, I'm suspending you, right? I'm writing you off. I'm not going to work with you anymore. I'm done with that person. They're just terrible at their job. I've seen plenty of people over the last good handful of years that initially were labeled as not great in whatever aspect, that really just needed somebody to come alongside them and help them out to get them to the place where they needed to be. And now people are like, man, how great is that person? They're one of like the strongest people we've got. But it takes time and it takes willingness to come alongside people and not just write them off, quote unquote, suspend them, right? Like what we do. It's the same ideas though. You have to do those same things with adults that you're saying they should be doing with kids.
Or better yet, if you hear somebody disagreeing with you, and sometimes it's not always, like you said, like in the most appropriate tone or whatever, because people write on emotion. I'm guilty of this too. It's good for you to know that you have time and space, but really think about, this is their feelings and why do they feel that way?
Yeah, sure.
And listen and say, hey, I hear you're feeling super frustrated. Let's talk through that. How can I support you better? Where's the root of this? Because it's a reflection on you ultimately as a building administrator or district leader, that if you're not really listening to why people feel that way, because those feelings are valid, and how can you reflect and better your practices to make sure that people have the forum that they don't feel like they need to come, or they're that stressed they need to come talk to you in a certain manner, right?
Yeah.
So, but it goes back to kids, right? Kids will often be like disrespectful, right?
Sure.
They're disrespectful, right? But it goes back to what's the root cause of it, and how can I better support this kid so they don't feel like they need to be disrespectful to me.
Yeah. It's actually really hard. Like that's the harder part a lot of times than working with the kids and actually implementing this with kids in our own practices, is how do we interact with the adults to help them along in the process? Because I think we get we worry way more about what adults think, right? If the adults are saying we're terrible at our job, or that we're a liar, or that any number of labels, right, that they're gonna throw at us at times, or have already. But but I think it's hard because you have all that, but you have to be willing to stick with people and see them through some of those times. And not everybody's going to get it or buy in or whatever, but I think way more people will than what we expect if we're willing to stick with them, build a relationship, see them through those tough times. Understand, again, like you said, I think a great point, like understand, give yourself time and space so you're in a good headspace to be able to have those conversations. But yeah, you have to be able to circle back and understand and show people that you're not just giving up on them, or that you don't think that they're terrible at their job, or whatever it might be.
Yeah. I agree. It's the adult preconditions. This work is shifting adults' mindsets and approach. It has nothing to do with the kids.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is hard.
Sorry.
Because adults' brains are harder to shift, right?
Yep.
All right. So what do we want people to kind of walk away knowing from this episode?
I think that it really starts with the adults, like the approach. Then we talk about trauma-informed care and misconceptions. I think people really have a hard time because it takes a lot of self-reflection. You really have to kind of know yourself really well. You have to know why your belief systems are that way. I think it's creating systems in place, and you have to have some strong leadership to create systems and have people buy in and kind of lead the professional development. I think we know too much about research and science right now that we'll keep on anchoring back to that this is a proven approach if we want to shift things. That if you want to keep education system going the same way, keep doing what you're doing, how's that working for you, right?
Sure.
I think we can see systematic change and really helping and healing kids and getting to the free parental cortex so they can learn if we really take on this approach. But it takes some time and some talent to figure out how you even launch and create those system shifts, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, it was two different groups of people, right? You've got the group of people that are kind of bought into this, and the group of people that maybe aren't quite so bought into this yet. I think for the group of people that maybe if you aren't so bought into this yet, kind of good for you. Don't just automatically buy into everything that somebody tells you, first of all. And I think that's kind of where I land. It took me a little while to, I don't even want to say come around, but to believe and have looked into it enough myself to say this is the right approach, right? Somebody didn't come and just present it and I was like, yes, I'm going for it. That's not my personality. It's not what I really do. I think though that if you aren't bought in yet, find ways to, obviously you're listening to this podcast, so that's something. Read books, find trainings, and decide for yourself why this does make sense. And how it looks for you. Because again, it looks a little bit different for everybody, but there's the same main pillars that hold it all up. But how it ultimately exactly looks, it's okay for it to look a little bit different. But you have to find out why it works for you. actually look into stuff. Don't just write it off. Don't be closed-minded to it. Like, just go ahead and look into stuff, research it some, and find out. If you're, and I'll probably be harsher towards this group of people, if you're somebody that is bought in, you've got to do both sides of the work. The part that feels good because you're building a relationship with a kid and you're having, fun, you're getting closer to them, you're noticing that you're making an impact with them, they buy into you, they trust you, all those things. You're doing that fun part. That's good. Do that part. My gosh, you've got to do the other part where when the kid needs boundaries and the kid needs expectations and the kid needs consequences for something they've chosen to do and discipline to be implemented in some way, you cannot all of a sudden bail and be gone, because all that does is hurt the overall cause of how people understand what this work is. It is not easy, and that is it's hard to do, and it doesn't always feel bubbly inside to be on the other side where you're setting a limit, and now the junior that had a really great relationship with you is like, hey, screw you. I hate you. I thought you were on my side, but you're just like every other adult in my life, and they storm out, right? That doesn't feel great. Yeah. But that junior probably needs boundaries and expectations or a consequence. That first grader, you fill in the blank, right? You can, all kinds of examples, but you have to be able to do that side of it, because if not, all people see is, well, this is just a bunch of BS where people are just having kids have fun, handing them some snacks, letting them play in their room during their free period, and then they go off and do whatever they want, but nobody really cares and nobody's really like disciplining them, and that kid can get away with murder and all of these things. And it just makes people believe that that's what trauma-informed care is, and it is that much slower for people to buy in, and rightfully so, because if that's what trauma-informed care was and that's how it looked in schools, it would be terrible, and it would not be an approach to have. And so you have to be able to do both sides, even though it's hard.
Yeah, and I would say ultimately, at the end of the day, kids have not had a lot of resilience adults that have loved them through the good times and the bad times. So you loving them through the bad times, which sometimes means consequences and boundaries, and being there on the other side, that's what they need. Yeah,
it actually makes you have the strongest relationship with that kid, and it actually is the most caring thing, and it actually will build it stronger in the end. But it's hard. It's hard.
It's hard work.
Well, thank you guys as always. We really appreciate you always joining in the conversation. We want to hear questions, comments. If you've listened to this and you're like, I adamantly disagree with what you just said, or anything like that, I would love to hear that. Like, if we don't hear those things, we can't have a conversation about it.
We can't address the misconceptions, right?
Yeah, right. So let us know. Let us know what you hear in your buildings, in your position, what you hear misconceptions are, or what questions you might have, or what comments you have. We're always loving to hear all those things. But yeah, we just really appreciate you guys being a part of the conversation and joining in with us. And let's go out there and do the work.
Yep, let's go do it. Clearing up those misconceptions, right?
Hey everybody, let's keep the conversation going.
Like and subscribe below and keep the comments rolling.